The first sign that something had changed was when every missile the alien fleet had launched toward Earth suddenly detonated in space thousands of kilometers from their targets, and Admiral Threxnall demanded explanations from his weapons officers, who had no answers because their systems reported successful launches and proper trajectories. Then the defense platforms appeared, and they had been floating dormant in high orbit for millions of years, disguised as asteroids or debris. But now, they came alive with power that made their hulls glow, and energy weapons that no living species could match, began tracking the invasion fleet with patient precision. Admiral Kyung-soo watched his tactical display transform as hundreds of new contacts materialized across the solar system, and his tactical officer reported that precursor installations were activating on Mars and Luna and Earth itself, and beneath the oceans and in the asteroid belt and everywhere humans had ever explored without realizing they were walking past ancient machines. Dae-sung collapsed in his chair because the effort of writing that final command sequence had drained everything from him, but Hana caught him before he fell, and she was laughing and crying at the same time because they had done it and they were still alive. The Mars installation's main power systems came fully online, and the entire structure began to rise from beneath the planet's surface, where it had been buried under millions of years of dust and rock, and it was not just a station but a city or fortress the size of a small continent. Insu stared at the readings and realized that what they had activated was beyond anything humanity had imagined, because the precursor defense network was not scattered pieces of technology, but a unified system that had been waiting for someone to speak to it properly. Young Mi felt the ground shake in her shelter, and people panicked thinking it was another bombardment. But then the announcements changed and voices told them that something impossible was happening, and that they should remain calm and wait for further instructions. 13 massive shapes emerged from beneath Mars and Luna and Earth's ocean floors, and they were precursor dreadnoughts that dwarfed the largest ships in the alien invasion fleet, and they moved with grace that should not have been possible for vessels so enormous. The dreadnoughts did not attack immediately, but instead positioned themselves in a defensive formation between Earth and the invasion fleet, and they waited with the patience of machines that had endured 3 million years of silence. Admiral Threxnall ordered his fleet to open fire on the precursor vessels because sitting idle meant admitting defeat, but his weapons struck barriers that materialized from nowhere and dissipated energy that could have destroyed planets. Point defense systems on the precursor dreadnoughts activated, and they swatted incoming missiles and fighters out of space with casual efficiency, while their main weapons remained silent and aimed but not firing. A message began broadcasting on every frequency, in every language known to the galaxy, and it was Dae-sung's voice but amplified through precursor systems, and translated by technology that could speak directly to the minds of sentient beings, regardless of their physiology. He said that humanity had asked the sleeping giants for protection, and they had answered not because humans commanded them, but because humans had taken time to understand and learn and approach with respect, rather than entitlement. He said that the precursors had built their language into their machines as a test, because they knew that any species capable of truly understanding that language would be worthy of using their technology. He said that humanity offered to share this knowledge with all species who approached in good faith, but would defend themselves against those who came with violence and fear. Admiral Threxnall listened to the broadcast and understood the terrible truth that his invasion fleet was obsolete and outmatched, and that continuing the attack would result in his forces being destroyed without the precursors needing to kill anyone, because their technology was so advanced they could simply disable ships and leave them drifting. The other alien commanders in the coalition realized the same thing, and they began arguing over their communication channels about whether to retreat or press the attack, and some wanted to negotiate, while others refused to accept defeat. Tamed seized the moment and broadcasted his own message offering to open diplomatic channels and establish treaties that would ensure the precursor technology would never be used for conquest or aggression. Several alien governments broke from the coalition immediately and requested emergency negotiations because they saw opportunity where others saw only threat. Zal Threen refused to accept the situation and ordered his personal fleet to attack the nearest precursor dreadnought in a desperate attempt to prove that the ancient vessels could be destroyed. The dreadnought responded by creating a localized gravitational field that pulled Zal Threen's flagship out of formation without harming anyone aboard, and then a tractor beam dragged it away from the battle space and left it drifting, but intact. The message was clear and unmistakable, because the precursors had built their defenses to protect without killing, and their technology was so sophisticated it could neutralize threats without resorting to destruction. Admiral Threxnall made the difficult decision to order a full retreat, because he was a warrior, but not a fool, and he knew when a battle was lost beyond any hope of victory. The invasion fleet began withdrawing in sections, and some commanders went reluctantly, while others fled as quickly as their ships could manage, and within 2 hours the skies above Earth were clear of enemy vessels. Young Mi emerged from her shelter along with millions of other civilians, and they looked up at the sky where precursor dreadnoughts hung like guardian moons, and for the first time in days she allowed herself to believe her brother might actually be alive. Ji-Wan brought the wandering star down to the Mars facility, and she rushed into the control center, where she found Dae-Sung conscious but exhausted, and she told him he was either the luckiest fool in the galaxy or the most brilliant scholar who ever lived. Dae-Sung smiled weakly and said he was probably both, because luck and preparation were difficult to separate when dealing with technology 3 million years old. Hana helped him stand, and together they walked outside the facility where they could see the massive dreadnoughts hanging in orbit, and the defense platforms that had transformed Earth's space into the most heavily protected system in known space. Admiral Kyung-soo arrived with a military escort to personally thank Dae-Sung and offer him any position or reward he wanted. But Dae-Sung said he did not want medals or titles, because the work was its own reward in Sue. And the other linguists gathered around, and they began planning how to establish a formal institute for precursor studies where scholars from all species could learn to translate the ancient language properly. Sun-Hee reported that intelligence suggested several alien governments were already requesting permission to send their own linguists to study with human teachers because they recognized that understanding was better than ignorance. Tamed negotiated treaties with remarkable speed because the political situation had shifted dramatically, and humanity was no longer a minor species but a major power that controlled access to technology. Everyone wanted. Admiral Kyung-soo recommended caution, because sudden power often led to sudden enemies, and he warned that the galaxy would test humanity in new ways, now that they were no longer weak. Young Mi reunited with her brother in an emotional scene where she hit him for scaring her, and then hugged him for saving her, and Dae-Sung held his sister and promised he would never take such risks again, even though they both knew he was lying. Months passed, and the Precursor Communication Institute was established in orbit around Earth, and students from dozens of species came to learn not just the language, but the philosophy behind it, because Dae-Sung insisted that translation without understanding was meaningless. The Galactic Council formally recognized humanity's claim to precursor sites in their territory, but also established guidelines for how the technology could be shared and used and regulated. Some precursor installations remained dormant because Dae-Sung and his team decided that not all ancient systems should be awakened without better understanding of their purpose and function. The dreadnoughts that had defended Earth did not remain in the solar system, but instead moved to positions throughout human space and established patrol routes that protected colonies from pirates and raiders. Vexthar, the insectoid curator who had mocked Dae-Sung, requested a meeting and formally apologized for his dismissal of human scholarship, and asked if the archive could establish a partnership with the new institute. Dae-Sung accepted the apology and the partnership, because holding grudges served no purpose, and the work was more important than old wounds. Ralmoth, the security officer who had arrested him, sent a message saying that he hoped there were no hard feelings, and Dae-Sung replied that he understood everyone had been doing their jobs. Yan and his soldiers were decorated for their defense of the Mars facility, and several of them joined the permanent security force assigned to protect precursor sites. And scholars, Mireille helped Ji-Wan retrofit the Wandering Star with some minor precursor technology that made the ship faster and more efficient, and Ji-Wan joked that saving crazy scholars occasionally paid off better than honest freight work. The council chamber stretched wide like an ocean of metal and light, and Yuna stood at its center feeling smaller than she ever had in her entire life. Above her, beings from 100 different worlds watched from their elevated platforms, their eyes glowing in colors she had no names for, their bodies shaped in ways that defied the rules of nature she had learned as a child. Some floated in tanks of liquid. Others existed as clouds of energy barely contained within force fields, and a few looked almost human, except for the wrong number of limbs or eyes that saw beyond the visible spectrum. The air hummed with translation devices working overtime to convert thousands of languages into something everyone could understand, creating a background noise that made her teeth ache. She wore her uniform, but it felt wrong here among these ancient races, like wearing children's clothes to a funeral. The fabric was crisp and clean, decorated with medals she had earned in battles these aliens probably considered insignificant, and on her chest sat a badge that nobody in this room recognized yet. Her hand stayed at her sides, steady despite the trembling she felt in her bones, and she kept her chin up even though every instinct screamed at her to look down and make herself invisible. The chairman of the council was called Velthar, and he looked like someone had carved a mountain into the shape of a person and then filled it with purple light that pulsed like a heartbeat. His voice boomed through the chamber without needing any device to amplify it, resonating in frequencies that made the floor vibrate beneath her boots. "Commander Una of Earth," he said, and the way he pronounced her world's name made it sound like an insult. "You stand accused of violating the Treaty of Stars, deploying weapons technology banned by unanimous vote of this council, and acting without proper authority in matters of galactic security." Behind her, Ambassador Jinho shifted nervously on his feet, and she could hear his rapid breathing even over the chamber's ambient noise. He was a good man, intelligent and well-meaning, but he was a diplomat trained for negotiations about trade routes and cultural exchanges, not military tribunals that could decide the fate of their entire species. He had tried to prepare her for this meeting, coaching her on proper protocols and warning her about which council members to avoid offending, but they both knew none of that mattered now. "The charges are serious," Velthar continued, his crystalline fingers tapping against his podium in a rhythm that might have been impatience or might have been something else entirely. 3 months ago, human vessels were detected in the Helios boundary region, deploying weapon systems that match the profile of banned antimatter cascade devices. These weapons are prohibited under Section 14 of the treaty because they pose existential risks to nearby solar systems. When challenged by patrol vessels from the Archon Collective, your ships refused to stand down and continued their deployment. This behavior is unacceptable. Una listened to the accusations piling up like stones on her chest, each one technically true but missing all the context that mattered. Yes, she had deployed those weapons. Yes, she had refused to stand down. And yes, she had done it all without seeking permission from this council, or even from the entirety of Earth's government. General Tamed knew, appearing now as a flickering hologram off to her right, his face carefully blank as he watched the proceedings. He had authorized her mission, or at least hadn't stopped it when he learned what she was planning. But she wouldn't drag him down with her if this went badly. "We demand an explanation," said another council member, this one resembling an insect the size of a small vehicle, its mandibles clicking with each word. "By what authority does a junior species act with such disregard for established law? Your people have held council membership for barely 30 years. You are children playing with forces you do not understand." Other voices joined in, a cascade of accusations and demands that blended together into a wall of sound. They called humanity reckless, dangerous, primitive. They suggested sanctions, quarantines, even expulsion from the council. Some of the more aggressive species made thinly veiled threats about enforcing compliance through military action. Through it all, Una remained silent, waiting for the storm to exhaust itself, knowing that speaking too soon would only make things worse. Finally, Velthar raised one massive hand and silence fell like a curtain dropping. "Enough," he said. "Before we pass judgment, the accused will answer our questions. Commander Una, you will explain yourself. What rank do you truly hold? What authority grants you the right to make decisions that affect the entire galaxy? Show us your credentials and justify your actions, or face the consequences of your defiance." The chamber fell silent in a way that felt heavy, expectant, like the moment before lightning strikes. Every eye, regardless of how many each species possessed, focused on her. Jinho stopped breathing entirely. Even Tamed's hologram leaned forward slightly. This was the moment everything had been building toward, the question she had known they would ask and had dreaded answering, because once she revealed the truth, nothing would ever be the same. Her hand moved to her chest, fingers finding the badge she had carried for 15 years. The one that had burned itself into her identity until she couldn't remember who she had been before it found her. The metal was warm under her touch, always warm, as if it contained its own internal fire. She unpinned it carefully, the motion deliberate and slow, giving herself time to consider if this was really what she wanted to do. There was still time to lie, to claim she had acted on Earth's authority alone, to take whatever punishment the Council deemed appropriate, and protect the secret that had consumed her life. But looking at these gathered species, at their certainty that humanity was nothing more than ambitious children, she knew that lies would only delay the inevitable. They needed to understand what was coming, and they needed to understand why she had done what she did. She held the badge up where everyone could see it, then placed it on the projection table at the center of the chamber. The table's systems activated automatically, scanning the object and enlarging its image so that every being in the room could examine it in detail. The badge was circular, about the size of her palm, made from a metal that didn't exist in any periodic table known to modern science. Symbols covered its surface, geometric patterns that hurt to look at too long because they seemed to exist in more dimensions than the eye could process. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. The insectoid council member stumbled backward, its many legs tangling in confusion. Several other species made sounds that their translation devices rendered as gasps or curses. One delegate, a being made of what looked like living water, actually fled the chamber entirely. But the most telling reaction came from the oldest beings present, the ones called archivists who served as the Council's institutional memory. Their leader, an ancient creature named Korath, whose species had been traveling the stars since before humans discovered fire, stood slowly from his seat, his movements stiff with age and shock. His voice, when he spoke, shook with an emotion Yuna couldn't identify. "That symbol," he said. "That cannot be. It is impossible. That badge belongs to the predecessors, the civilization that vanished 3,000 years before any of our species achieved spaceflight. They left ruins scattered across 1,000 worlds, but no survivors, no descendants, nothing but mysteries we have spent millennia trying to solve." Velthar's purple light flickered rapidly, a sign of distress in his species. "Explain this, human. How does your kind possess an artifact of the predecessors? Such items are beyond priceless, restricted to academic study under the strictest protocols. If Earth has been looting predecessor sites, the consequences will be severe beyond your imagining." Yuna took a breath, gathering her thoughts and her courage. "We found it," she said simply. 15 years ago, beyond the edge of charted space, my ship discovered a predecessor facility. It was still active, still operational, and it recognized something in me. It gave me this badge and showed me things, terrible things that no one else knows. The weapons I deployed weren't an act of aggression. They were preparation for what's coming, for the enemy that destroyed the predecessors and is now returning to finish what it started. The chamber erupted into chaos, voices shouting over each other. But Yuna kept her eyes on the badge, on the symbol that had changed everything. She had their attention now, but she wondered if that was a blessing or a curse. The chaos in the council chamber continued for several minutes before Velthar managed to restore order, his booming voice cutting through the panicked conversations and angry accusations like a blade through smoke. Yuna stood perfectly still at the center of it all, an island of calm in a sea of alien confusion, knowing that the hard part was just beginning. Claiming to possess a predecessor artifact was one thing, but proving its authenticity and explaining how she came to hold it would require her to relive memories she had spent years trying to forget. Korath, the ancient archivist, descended from his platform using some form of gravity manipulation that made him appear to float rather than walk, his elderly form moving with surprising grace despite the weight of uncounted centuries. He approached the projection table where Yuna's badge still rotated in holographic form, its symbols catching the light in ways that seemed impossible. His species had no face in the human sense, just a collection of sensory organs arranged around a central core, but Yuna had learned to read the subtle shifts in his body language. Right now, every part of him radiated disbelief mixed with desperate hope. "I must examine it," Korath said, his voice quieter than before, almost reverent. "If this is genuine, if this is truly a predecessor command badge, then everything we know about galactic history must be reconsidered. But forgive my skepticism, Commander. In 10,000 years of searching, across countless excavations and investigations, we have never found a functional predecessor device. They left behind ruins and fragments, dead technology that we can barely understand, let alone operate. What you claim defies all established knowledge. Yuna nodded, understanding his doubt because she had felt the same way 15 years ago when her world had turned upside down. I know how it sounds, she said. I didn't believe it either, not at first. But I'll tell you what happened. And you can judge for yourself whether I'm lying or insane or telling the truth you've been searching for all these years. Velthar made a gesture that his species used to indicate permission to continue. Though the rigidity of his posture suggested he remained deeply skeptical, the other council members settled into an uneasy silence, their attention fixed on Yuna with an intensity that made her skin prickle. Even Jinho had stopped fidgeting, caught up in a story he had only heard fragments of through classified briefings. I was 22 years old, Yuna began, letting herself fall into the memory even though it hurt like pressing on a fresh bruise. Lieutenant Yuna back then, barely out of the academy, assigned to a deep space exploration vessel called the Morning Star. Our captain was Deho, a good man who believed that humanity's future lay in understanding the galaxy rather than fearing it. We were mapping systems beyond the established trade routes, places where no one went because there was nothing there worth the fuel costs. She paused, gathering her thoughts, trying to find words simple enough to convey the magnitude of what they had discovered. We found an anomaly on our sensors, something that shouldn't have existed in the empty space between galaxies. A structure, massive beyond anything humanity had built, just floating in the void like it had been waiting for us. Daiho wanted to ignore it and continue our mission, but our science officer convinced him to take a closer look. We thought maybe it was a derelict ship from some species we hadn't encountered yet, something we could salvage or study. Korath made a sound that his translator rendered as a sharp intake of breath, and several other council members leaned forward in their seats. They knew the significance of what she was describing even before she finished, because finding intact predecessor sites was the dream that had driven archaeologists and treasure hunters across the galaxy for millennia. When we got close enough for detailed scans, we realized what we were looking at. The architectural style matched predecessor ruins that had been catalogued on dozens of worlds, but this facility showed no signs of damage or decay. Its power systems were still active, generating energy through methods our sensors couldn't identify. Lights moved through its corridors like blood through veins. It was alive in a way that ancient ruins aren't supposed to be. She remembered the fear that had gripped the crew, the debates about whether they should report their discovery to Earth authorities or investigate on their own. In the end, curiosity had won over caution, a very human trait that Deho had said would either make them famous or get them all killed. We assembled an exploration team, myself, Captain Deho, our engineer Minji, and 12 others. We suited up, took weapons we hoped we wouldn't need, and entered through an airlock that opened for us like it had been expecting visitors. The memory of that first step into the facility remained vivid enough to make her heart race. The interior had been beautiful and terrifying, filled with corridors that twisted in directions that hurt her brain to follow, and rooms that seemed larger on the inside than their outer dimensions should allow. Every surface had been covered in the same geometric symbols that now decorated her badge, and looking at them had given her a headache that lasted for days afterward. We found archives, she continued. Computer systems still running after who knows how many thousands of years, maintaining records in languages none of us could read. Minji managed to interface with them using a universal connector protocol, and the systems responded. They started showing us things, images and videos of a civilization that spanned the galaxy, beings that looked almost human but not quite, building wonders that made our greatest achievements look like children's toys. Jinho interrupted for the first time, his diplomatic training overcoming his shock. Why didn't you report this immediately? Discovery of an active predecessor site would be the most important find in galactic history. Earth's government should have been notified, and through them, the Council. It was a fair question, one that Yuna had asked herself countless times over the years. Because the facility showed us more than just their achievements, she said quietly. It showed us how they died. The predecessors didn't just vanish or ascend to some higher plane of existence like the popular theories suggest. They were destroyed, hunted to extinction by something they called the Silence. The archives contained battle logs, desperate final messages, recordings of worlds being consumed by an enemy that left nothing behind. Watching it was like witnessing the end of everything over and over. until the reality of it burned itself into your mind. The council chamber had grown so quiet that Yuna could hear the subtle hum of the station's life support systems, a sound usually drowned out by ambient noise. Every being present understood the implications of what she was saying. The suggestion that the predecessors, with all their advanced technology and cosmic power, had been defeated by something strong enough to wipe them from existence. We found a sealed vault deep in the facility's core, Yuna continued, pushing through the story even though her throat felt tight. It required biometric authorization, genetic verification that would prove the person trying to access it had the right to inherit what was inside. The system scanned all 15 of us, running our DNA through comparisons against its database. 14 came back negative, but mine triggered something. Alarms started blaring, lights flashing, and the vault door began to open. She could still remember the moment with perfect clarity. The way her teammates had stared at her with expressions mixing awe and fear. The way Minji had grabbed her arm and asked if she was all right. The way Captain Deho had drawn his weapon, not knowing whether to protect Yuna or protect everyone from her. Inside the vault, I found this badge, a neural interface device and a message projected directly into my mind in a language I shouldn't have understood, but somehow did. It said, "To whoever inherits this, finish what we could not." Korath moved closer, his sensory organs focused entirely on Yuna's face. "What did the facility tell you? What genetic markers did it find in your DNA that matched predecessor biology?" "That's the part nobody understands," Yuna admitted. "Humans share approximately 98% of our DNA with certain Earth primates, and we have genetic markers that connect us to every living thing on our planet's evolutionary tree. But according to that facility's analysis, buried deep in what scientists call junk DNA, there are sequences that match predecessor genetics, not perfectly, not even closely, but enough to trigger recognition protocols. It's like humanity is a distant echo of what they were, separated by so much time and change that we became something new, but carrying traces of them in our very cells." The implications of that statement hit the council like a physical blow. If humans were somehow related to the predecessors, even distantly, it upended every theory about their origins and disappearance. It suggested that they hadn't been completely destroyed, that some fragment of their civilization had survived and evolved over millions of years into something different. "Impossible," said one of the council members, a being whose species prided themselves on logic and reason. "The timeline doesn't work. Humanity's evolutionary history is well documented, traced back through millions of years on your single planet. You cannot simultaneously be indigenous to Earth and descended from a spacefaring civilization." Korath broke the silence by moving to the projection table and placing one of his appendages near Yuna's badge. Not quite touching it, but close enough that the holographic display rippled in response. From somewhere within his robes, he produced a small device that looked like it had been assembled from crystal and ancient metal, its surface covered in symbols that matched those on the badge. "There is a way to verify her claim," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone about to reveal a carefully guarded secret. "My order has protected certain predecessor artifacts for generations, passing them down along with the knowledge of how to use them. This authenticator was found in a temple ruin 7,000 years ago, and according to the text that accompanied it, it can verify genuine predecessor command devices." He activated the authenticator, and it began to glow with a soft blue light that pulsed in rhythm with something Yuna couldn't identify. The light extended toward her badge, and where the two met, the air itself seemed to shimmer and twist. Symbols appeared in the space between them, geometric patterns that rotated through dimensions her eyes couldn't quite follow, and then suddenly the badge blazed with brilliant light that filled the entire chamber. Every screen, every display, every piece of technology in the room responded to it, showing the same symbol that adorned its surface, and Yuna felt the neural interface activate in her mind, connecting her to systems she had learned to keep dormant. The light faded after a moment that felt like eternity, and Korath withdrew his authenticator with movements that seemed almost reverent. When he spoke, his voice shook with emotion that his species rarely displayed publicly. "It is genuine," he said. "What Commander Yuna carries is a true predecessor command badge, authenticated by protocols that cannot be faked or duplicated. The implications are staggering, but we must accept the evidence before us." The council chamber erupted into controlled chaos, delegates conferring with advisors through private communication channels, species representatives arguing in hushed tones about what this revelation meant for their people. Velthar attempted to maintain order, but even his authority seemed diminished by the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. Una stood at the center of it all, feeling exposed and vulnerable, knowing that her life had just become infinitely more complicated. Ambassador Jinho approached her during the confusion, his face pale but his eyes sharp with diplomatic calculation. "They're going to want to control you," he whispered urgently. "Once they finish processing the shock, every species in this council will see you as either a threat or a resource to be exploited. Earth needs to establish clear protocols for how we handle this situation, and we need to do it quickly." Before Una could respond, Velthar's voice boomed through the chamber again, demanding attention. "The authentication is complete," he announced. "We must now address the broader implications of Commander Una's claims. If the predecessors truly faced an existential threat significant enough to destroy their civilization, and if that threat is returning, then this council must take action. However, we cannot simply accept the word of one individual no matter what artifacts she possesses. We require evidence, independent verification, and a clear understanding of what we face." General Tamed's hologram flickered as he stepped forward, his presence commanding, despite being only a projection. "Earth's government has been aware of Commander Una's discoveries for over a decade," he said, and Una felt a flash of gratitude that he was willing to share the burden of secrecy. "We chose not to reveal this information immediately, because we knew it would cause exactly the kind of panic and political maneuvering we're seeing now. We've spent years studying the predecessor facilities, attempting to understand their technology, and monitoring for any signs of the threat they documented. 3 months ago, our worst fears were confirmed when deep space monitoring stations detected energy signatures that exactly matched those described in the predecessor archives." He gestured, and data appeared on the chamber's main displays, showing sensor readings and analysis charts that meant little to most of those present, but would be devastating to anyone who understood what they were looking at. These readings come from 17 different locations across the galaxy, all detected within a 2-week period. They represent technology that doesn't match any known civilization, energy patterns that shouldn't be possible according to conventional physics, and they're getting stronger. Whatever the predecessors called the silence, it appears to be probing our galaxy's defenses, testing for weaknesses before committing to a full invasion. One of the council members, a being whose species specialized in scientific analysis, spoke up with skepticism clear in their translated voice. "These readings could be natural phenomena, unusual stellar events that we simply don't have experience interpreting. You're asking us to prepare for war based on ancient records and ambiguous sensor data." Una had expected this reaction, had prepared for the inevitable denial that came when people were confronted with threats too large to comprehend. "I thought the same thing," she admitted. "When the first readings came through, I spent weeks trying to find alternative explanations. But then one of our monitoring stations went silent. We sent a ship to investigate and found nothing. No debris, no distress signal, no evidence that the station or its crew had ever existed. The only thing our sensors detected was a faint energy signature, matching the ones from the predecessor archives. Already fading by the time we arrived, she pulled up images from the investigation, showing empty space where a military installation should have been, sensor logs that documented the complete absence of matter in a location that had held a station, crew quarters, supply ships, and over 300 personnel just days before. 300 people vanished without a trace," she said quietly. "No distress calls, no evacuation, no signs of struggle. Just gone, erased so completely that we couldn't even find atoms. That's when I knew we were out of time. When I started activating the predecessor defense network, regardless of whether it violated council treaties. The images on the displays affected the council more than any words could have, showing them the reality of what Una had been trying to prevent. Species that had been dismissive moments before now looked uncertain, their earlier confidence shaken by evidence they couldn't easily explain away. Even Velthar seemed subdued, his crystalline form dimming slightly as he processed the implications. Korath spoke again, his ancient voice carrying wisdom earned over centuries. "I have studied the predecessors longer than most species in this chamber have existed," he said. "I have explored their ruins, translated their texts, and tried to understand why such an advanced civilization would simply disappear. The common theory suggested transcendence, voluntary exodus to another dimension, or perhaps collective suicide in the face of some philosophical crisis. But I always suspected the truth was darker, that they were destroyed by something powerful enough to erase them from history. If Commander Yuna's evidence is accurate, if the silence truly exists and is returning, then we face a threat that defeated beings far more advanced than any of us. He turned to face Yuna directly, and she could feel the intensity of his focus even though his species had no eyes in the conventional sense. You mentioned a network of facilities, defense systems left behind by the predecessors. How many have you accessed? And what capabilities do they possess? Yuna had known this question would come eventually, and she had debated how much to reveal. Full honesty might make the Council view her as too dangerous to leave free, but partial truths would only breed suspicion. There are 17 major facilities that we've identified, she said. I've personally accessed 5 of them using the authorization codes this badge provides. Each one contains weapon systems, automated defense platforms, and ship construction facilities capable of producing vessels using technology centuries beyond our current capabilities. The facilities are damaged, barely functional after being abandoned for so long. But even at partial capacity, they represent more military power than any single species currently possesses. The reaction was immediate and predictable, with several species representatives demanding that the facilities be placed under Council control, others insisting that humanity had no right to monopolize predecessor technology, and a few quietly calculating how they might seize control for themselves. Yuna had expected this too, had planned for the inevitable power struggle that would come once the truth was revealed. You can't control them, she said flatly, cutting through the arguing voices. The facilities only respond to someone carrying a predecessor command badge, and they verify genetic markers before granting access. I'm the only person who has successfully activated them, and even for me it's dangerous. The neural interface required to operate their systems isn't designed for human biology. Every time I use it, it changes me a little, overwrites some of my neural pathways with predecessor data. My doctors estimate I have maybe 5 more years before I stop being human in any meaningful sense. The chamber fell silent again, and Yuna saw something shift in how the Council members looked at her, their expressions moving from fear and emergency lighting flickered to life throughout the Council chamber, casting everything in shades of red that made the alien delegates look even more otherworldly than usual. Yuna's military training took over before conscious thought could interfere, her body moving toward the nearest tactical display while her mind processed the sensor data streaming across suddenly active screens. What she saw made her blood run cold because the readings matched exactly what the predecessor archives had shown her. Energy signatures that bent physics in ways that shouldn't be possible. Movement patterns that suggested intelligence but not life as any species understood it. Velthar's crystalline form pulsed with rapid fluctuations that indicated severe distress in his species. But his voice remained steady when he spoke. All delegates remained calm and proceed to evacuation stations in an orderly manner. This station has defensive capabilities sufficient to handle any conventional threat, while we determine the nature of this intrusion. Yuna almost laughed at the futility of that statement, at how completely unprepared they all were for what was coming. She pressed her hand against her badge and felt the neural interface surge to full activation, flooding her consciousness with information about the station's underlying systems, the predecessor-era foundation that existed beneath layers of modern construction that the Council didn't even know about. The ancient facility had been built first millions of years ago, and successive civilizations had simply constructed their Council chambers on top of it, without realizing what they were building upon. Your conventional defenses won't work, she said, her voice cutting through the rising panic as delegates began pushing toward exits. What's approaching us isn't a ship or a fleet in any sense you understand. It's the silence, exactly what I warned you about. And if we don't activate the station's original defense systems right now, everyone in this chamber will be dead within the hour. She didn't wait for permission or approval, couldn't afford to waste time arguing with bureaucrats about protocol while an existential threat bore down on them. Her hands moved across the tactical display, interfacing with systems through the neural link, speaking commands in a language that shouldn't exist anymore but flowed from her lips like she had been born speaking it. Around the chamber, Walls began to shift and reconfigure, revealing weapon emplacements and shield generators that had been dormant since before the current species achieved spaceflight. The predecessor technology awakened with a sound like distant thunder, and Yuna felt it responding to her, recognizing the badge she carried as proof of authority. Korath moved to stand beside her, his ancient form surprisingly steady, despite the chaos erupting around them. "I had suspected this station was built on predecessor ruins," he said quietly, watching as the hidden systems came online. "My order has records suggesting that the Council's founders chose this location because they detected unusual energy readings, but we never imagined the facility was still functional." "What do your systems show about the approaching threat?" Yuna pulled up detailed sensor readings, wishing she didn't understand them so clearly, wishing the neural interface didn't fill her mind with tactical analysis, based on millions of years of accumulated warfare data. 3 vessels, though calling them vessels is misleading because they're not ships in any conventional sense. They're more like concentrated points of entropy, areas where the normal laws of physics have been suspended in favor of something else. The predecessors called them harvesters, sent ahead to probe defenses and gather information before the main force arrives. On the main display, visual feeds from external cameras showed the approaching threat, and several delegates stopped their panicked flight to stare at what they were seeing. The harvesters looked wrong. Geometrically impossible shapes that seemed to exist in more dimensions than human vision could process. Surfaces that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Edges that flickered between existence and absence. Just looking at them made Yuna's head hurt, made her stomach twist with instinctive revulsion, as if some deep part of her biology recognized that these things shouldn't exist. "They're beautiful in a terrible way," Jinho said, having moved to stand near Yuna despite the danger. His diplomatic training was showing in his attempt to find appropriate words for something that defied description. "Like looking at the opposite of creation, at everything that unmakes and destroys given physical form." 3 Council warships moved to intercept the harvesters, vessels from species that prided themselves on military prowess, equipped with weapons that could crack moons and shields that could withstand direct hits from antimatter warheads. Yuna wanted to warn them off, wanted to tell them that conventional warfare meant nothing against an enemy that operated outside normal physics, but she knew they wouldn't listen and there wasn't time to convince them. She watched through the sensor feeds as the warships opened fire, unleashing devastating volleys that would have vaporized any normal target. The weapons fire simply vanished when it contacted the harvesters, absorbed into the impossible geometry of their forms without causing any visible damage. For a moment nothing happened, and Yuna could imagine the confusion among the warship crews as they tried to understand why their attacks had no effect. Then the harvesters responded, and it wasn't an attack in any conventional sense. They extended tendrils of darkness that moved faster than light should travel, touched the warships, and the vessels simply ceased to exist. No explosion, no debris field, no energy release. Just there one moment and gone the next, as if they had been erased from reality. The council chamber descended into full panic at the sight of 3 warships vanishing without trace. Delegates abandoning any pretense of order and rushing toward evacuation pods. Yuna let them go, knowing they would be safer fleeing than staying. But she also knew that running wouldn't save them if the harvesters decided to pursue. The silence had come here for a reason, drawn by the activation of predecessor technology, and it wouldn't leave until it had destroyed what it came to find. "Can the station's defenses stop them?" Tamed asked through his hologram, and Yuna heard the tension in his voice because he understood military reality well enough to know how badly outmatched they were. "Maybe," she said honestly, because the neural interface gave her probabilities rather than certainties. The predecessor weapons operate on similar principles to the silence, manipulating fundamental forces rather than relying on conventional physics. But the station's systems are damaged, operating at maybe 30% capacity, and I've never actually used them in combat. I'm about to learn how to fight a war that ended millions of years ago, while trying not to get us all killed in the process." She activated the station's primary weapon systems, feeling them respond to her commands like extensions of her own body, and the sensation was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Ports opened along the station's exterior, revealing crystalline arrays that began to glow with building energy. The weapons didn't fire projectiles or beams, instead creating disruption fields that targeted the mathematical foundations of how matter and energy interacted. Where these fields intersected with the approaching harvesters, Reality itself seemed to scream, space-time twisting and buckling as two incompatible physical laws fought for dominance. One of the harvesters shuddered and began to break apart, its impossible geometry fracturing as the disruption field forced it to obey conventional physics. But the other two adapted with frightening speed, reconfiguring their forms to root around the attack. Una swore and adjusted her targeting, working purely on instinct and the tactical knowledge flooding through the neural interface, fighting an enemy she had never faced using weapons she barely understood. The station shook as the harvesters returned fire, their entropy weapons eroding the predecessor shields, and warning alarms screamed about structural integrity failing in multiple sections. "Evacuate the civilian sections," she ordered, not sure who she was even talking to anymore as the chain of command dissolved into chaos. "Get everyone into the core sections where the predecessor shielding is strongest. Korath, I need you to access the backup power systems. There should be a secondary reactor 3 levels below us that we can bring online." The ancient archivist moved with surprising speed, his reverence for predecessor technology overcoming any fear of the situation. Una continued fighting, her consciousness splitting between her human awareness and the tactical systems that showed her the battle from a dozen angles simultaneously. She destroyed the second harvester by overloading its dimensional anchors, forcing it to collapse into a singularity that consumed itself. But the third one was learning from her tactics, becoming harder to target with each passing moment. Ambassador Jinho was coordinating the evacuation with unexpected efficiency, directing panicked aliens through corridors they had never known existed toward shelter in the station's ancient core. General Tamed had arrived with the human fleet, along with vessels from several other council species who had overcome their shock enough to join the fight. They couldn't hurt the harvester directly, but they could at least draw its attention, giving Una precious seconds to set up her attacks.